feeling maybe a bit overwhelmed trying to keep up with all the digital threats flying around.
Yeah.
And wondering how all this cybersecurity chaos connects to data privacy rules and, well, the big question of cyber insurance. If that sounds familiar, believe me, you are not alone.
No, definitely not. It's a landscape that's just moving so incredibly fast, so many interconnected parts.
Wow.
It can feel impossible to really get a handle on sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's precisely why we're here today. Welcome to a deep dive into that really complex interplay. We're looking into the evolving world of cyber risk, the maze of data privacy regulations, and the litigation that often follows, and how cyber insurance fits into actually navigating it all.
Right. We've spent time digging through a whole stack of sources for you, analyses from insurance, industry experts, legal analysts, market observers, really trying to pull out the most critical insights you need. Our mission here is basically to give you that shortcut, that distilled view, so you're well informed in this crucial area.
Yeah. Whether you're the CISO, a business leader making tough decisions, or honestly just someone trying to figure out why your personal data seems to be everyone's business these days, understanding this landscape is, well, it's essential right now.
Absolutely. And, as we explore these different layers, the risks, the regulations, the management strategies, it's worth keeping in mind that getting a really clear picture of your own potential exposure is foundational. It's absolutely key to understanding where insurance even fits into your strategy.
Totally agree. Figuring out where you stand, what kind of protection makes sense for you, it's paramount. And, thankfully, resources exist to help cut through some of this complexity. Just like our sponsor, CyberInsuranceCalc.com, aims to help you understand your cyber risk exposure to guide those insurance decisions. Having the right information is just crucial. We'll definitely circle back to how quantifying risk helps with the insurance piece as we go. So let's just jump straight in then. The picture painted by the sources we looked at is, well, it's stark, but it's pretty clear. The cyber threat landscape isn't just changing anymore. It's becoming significantly more intense and varied.
Intense is definitely the right word. We're seeing not just more attacks, but attacks that are more sophisticated and, frankly, easier for criminals to deploy than ever before.
And ransomware, it's still dominating the headlines, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Experts are basically saying it's moved way past if it'll happen to how and when it might impact an organization. And this is largely fueled by the relentless growth of these cybercrime as a service models, which, effectively lowers the technical bar for attackers. Anyone can get in the game now.
That's such a critical point. The data shows roughly a 25% increase in ransomware attacks in 2024 compared to the year before. But what's really alarming is apparently only about 15% of these attacks ever become public knowledge. So the scale is probably much bigger than we even see. And the tactic of data exfiltration, stealing the data before they encrypt it, that nearly doubled.
Right. So it's not just about being locked out of your systems anymore. They're taking your sensitive information first, which creates this whole other layer of regulatory headaches, litigation risks, stuff we'll definitely get to. It's a nasty double threat.
Exactly. And even when law enforcement disrupts major groups, like they did with Lockbit, the sources highlight it's still a very dynamic environment. There are still something like 75 active ransomware groups operating out there.
Wow. And the impact, the financial impact, is just massive. Look at some of the examples from 2024 that the sources mentioned. Change Healthcare, part of the United Health Group, reportedly paid a $22 million ransom after an Alfie attack, but the total estimated impact, something like $2.4 billion.
Yeah, staggering. And CDK Global faced a $25 million demand from a group called Black Suit, leading to a reported $1 billion loss, impacting them and their customers like car dealerships. Then there was AT&T paying over $370,000 after a breach claimed by shiny hunters.
And you can't forget that record $75 million ransom reportedly paid by a Fortune 50 company last year. These numbers just show the sheer scale of potential financial damage we're talking about.
But it's definitely not just ransomware causing problems. Online scams, especially things like business email compromise, BEC, and the newer business communication compromise, BCC, are surging. The FBI estimates global losses from these kinds of scams over the last decade exceed $55 billion.
$55 billion. Wow. And here's where AI gets really interesting and, frankly, pretty terrifying. AI is making these social engineering attacks incredibly effective, isn't it?
It really is. It allows for super personalized, highly convincing phishing emails at scale. And even voice cloning for phishing attacks, voice phishing.
So you might get a call that sounds exactly like your boss asking for a wire transfer.
Precisely. And it's not just external threats. AI-enhanced scams can leverage existing trusted relationships, which leads to more insider threats, or vendor email compromise, where they impersonate a trusted supplier. Some reports even point to these vast fraud factories, particularly in Southeast Asia, potentially involving hundreds of thousands of people, some possibly victims of human trafficking themselves, just churning out these sophisticated scams.
That's chilling.
Yeah. And of course, data breaches remain a persistent and really costly risk. While the actual number of breaches might have dipped slightly in 2024 compared to 23, the number of victims whose data was exposed just exploded up by 257%. That's largely due to those mega-scale incidents hitting huge populations.
So it sounds like the really big hacks kind of skew the overall numbers, but the sources also stress that automation is making it easier for attackers to hit vulnerabilities everywhere. So smaller businesses are absolutely still at risk, right? They're not safe just because they're small.
Exactly right. They're often seen as easier targets. And a significant factor driving up the cost and the time it takes to resolve breaches is this concept of shadow data. That's basically information stored outside of the official IT-managed systems, maybe on old servers, employee laptops, cloud services people signed up for on their own.
Yeah.
It makes it much harder to identify what was taken, contain the breach, and ultimately report it accurately. All of that leads to higher costs and much longer containment times.
Okay, that makes sense. And speaking of things that are hard to see, supply chain vulnerabilities seem to be getting called out more and more, described as an Achilles heel in one source.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. A World Economic Forum report cited in the sources indicates something like 45% of organizations expect a significant supply chain attack by 2025. And over half of large organizations see managing that supply chain risk as a major barrier to their overall cyber resilience.
And the costs associated are just rocketing.
They really are. The projected cost related to these supply chain attacks is set to more than double from an estimated $60 billion in 2025 to a staggering $138 billion by 2031.
Wow. And I guess critical service providers like the big cloud platforms everyone relies on, they must be prime targets.
Huge targets. Cloud intrusions reportedly increased 75% in 2023. And often these intrusions stem from really basic security hygiene issues, weak credentials, misconfigured services. It highlights that the fundamentals are still absolutely critical.
Okay, so beyond these specific attack types, what about the broader trend? The sources mentioned a few shaping the future, right? AI seems central.
AI is front and center, definitely. It's the ultimate dual-edged sword, as you said earlier.
Right. We're seeing AI boosting defensive capabilities, making security teams more efficient, but it's also being weaponized to create attacks with unprecedented scale, speed, and precision.
Exactly. And insurers are already trying to figure out how AI impacts claims, like are risks related to AI model manipulation or AI hallucinations causing errors or IP infringement from AI-generated content. Are those things explicitly covered by current policies? That's still very much evolving.
Yeah, lots of questions there. And geopolitics seems like another massive driver.
Huge. Nation-state actors are increasingly using cyber capabilities as, tools of foreign policy and conflict. They're specifically targeting critical infrastructure, energy grids, transportation systems, telecommunications. Attacks on critical infrastructure globally apparently increased by 30% in just 1 year, from early 2023 to early 2024.
And their methods are sneaky, right? Using tools already on the network.
Yeah, often using what's called living off the land techniques, using legitimate tools already present on a target network to blend in and avoid detection. That, plus advanced persistent threats, APTs, DDoS attacks, cyber espionage. These aren't just data breaches anymore, they're serious national security issues.
And then there's the whole mis and disinformation problem, which seems related. Sure. The WEF ranked it as a top global risk.
It is, and AI tools just amplify this manipulation. It makes it easier than ever to create deepfakes, spread false narratives, influence public opinion, even using techniques like LLM grooming, basically manipulating AI models to produce biased or false outputs on command.
Right. And one last area mentioned was the convergence of IT with operational technology, OT,
Yeah.
and the industrial Internet of Things, IoT.
Yeah, basically connecting factory floors, industrial controls, smart devices. It creates a much wider attack surface. While this convergence offers great benefits and efficiency, it also introduces new vulnerabilities that can have real physical world consequences. And then you layer AI into that space, adding autonomous decision making. It just adds another layer of potential risk.
Okay, so that's the threat landscape, escalating, diversifying, becoming more complex. Given all that, how is the legal and regulatory world trying to respond? It sounds like it's getting equally complex, especially here in the U.S.
Absolutely. The sources really highlight a significant acceleration, particularly in state-level comprehensive privacy laws. 7 states enacted brand new ones just in 2024, and another 4 saw their laws take effect last year.
Wow, 7 new ones in a year. And the momentum isn't slowing down?
Not at all. There are 11 more states with laws already passed that are scheduled to come online in 2025 and 2026. By the time those are all active, roughly half the U.S. population will be covered by one of these state privacy frameworks.
Half the population. But they're not all the same, are they? The sources mentioned variations.
Right, that's a key point. While they often share a common foundation, things like rights to access or delete data, important distinctions are definitely emerging between the states. For example, Iowa's law is kind of notable because its default position on sensitive data is more controller-friendly. Companies can process it unless the consumer actively opts out, whereas many other states require an explicit opt-in first.
Okay, and Maryland sounded particularly strict.
Yeah, Maryland's law, which takes effect in October 2025, is seen as one of the strictest. It uniquely prohibits the sale of sensitive personal information altogether. No opting in or out, just no selling it. It also defines minors more broadly up to age 18, not 16 like many others, and it includes this interesting new or should have known standard for compliance.
Meaning ignorance isn't necessarily an excuse.
Pretty much. A business could be liable not just if they knew about a violation, but if they reasonably should have known based on their practices and the circumstances. That puts a bigger onus on companies to be proactive.
Interesting. What else stood out in the state laws?
Minnesota is breaking some new ground by giving consumers a right to question automated decision-making. That includes the right to understand the logic used and the specific data points involved in making a significant decision about them.
That seems increasingly relevant with AI.
Very much so. And New Jersey's law is interesting because it grants rulemaking authority to a state agency. This allows the rules to potentially adapt more dynamically to new technologies, although the specifics are still being worked out.
And Tennessee is offering sort of a carrot, right? An incentive.
Yeah, Tennessee's law recognizes an affirmative defense, basically a legal shield in lawsuits or enforcement actions for businesses that can demonstrate they comply with recognized frameworks, like the NIST cybersecurity framework, or have really well-documented internal privacy policies. It's a way to encourage good security practices.
Makes sense. And there seemed to be a big focus on kids' privacy and biometric data, too.
Huge focus. Florida's law, effective January 2025, is quite restrictive. It bans social media use entirely for kids 13 and under and requires parental consent for 14 and 15-year-olds, including using third-party age verification systems.
New York is also targeting youth privacy with its Safe for Kids Act. That one aims to restrict addictive feeds that are based on a minor's personal data and limits notifications overnight without parental consent.
And separate from that, another New York law now restricts employers from demanding access to employees' personal social media accounts, things not used for work.
Okay, so the states are incredibly active. What about the federal level? Were agencies busy too?
Incredibly busy in 2024. The FTC, SEC, CFTB, DOJ, HHS, FCC... Basically, all the key regulators were active. They covered a huge range of issues. Sensitive data, children's privacy, biometric data, health data, location data, data brokers, incident disclosure requirements, you name it.
What were some highlights from the FTC?
The FTC really zeroed in on sensitive data like geolocation and health information in its enforcement actions. They're also frequently integrating elements of their safeguards rule, which dictates data security standards into settlement agreements, like putting strict limits on who can access consumer data. They're also doing studies on personalized pricing based on consumer data, signaling potential future action there. And they finalized updates to Tekiyapur, the children's privacy rule, requiring opt-in consent for targeted advertising to kids and setting stricter data retention limits.
And the SEC. Mostly about the new disclosure rules for public companies.
Yeah, their new rule requiring disclosure of material cyber incidents within 4 business days fully kicked in. Interestingly, the sources noted that less than 20% of the initial filings made under this rule actually stated the incident was material within that tight time frame. So maybe companies are still figuring out that materiality threshold. The SEC also updated Regulation SP, which applies to financial institutions like brokers and investment advisors. It significantly shortens the time they have to notify customers of data breaches down to just 30 days.
Okay. And HHS for healthcare and IPA.
HHS, which enforces HIPAA, launched a new risk analysis initiative to help healthcare providers better assess their vulnerabilities. They also proposed strengthening the HIPAA security rule itself, potentially mandating specific controls like encryption for certain data and multi-factor authentication. And we're definitely seeing increased HIPAA enforcement. Examples mentioned include a $1.19 million penalty against Clearway Pain Solutions for various security rule violations, and another case where Holy Redeemer Family Medicine was penalized for improperly disclosing patient reproductive health information.
The DOJ seemed busy on multiple fronts, too.
Very active. They were enforcing a law called PAD-AFA against data brokers sending sensitive U.S. personal data to foreign countries of concern. They're also using their civil cyber fraud initiative to hold government contractors accountable if they have deficient cybersecurity practices, often referencing compliance with NIST standards. And of course, they continued major takedown operations against dark web marketplaces and ransomware groups like that Lockbit operation we mentioned earlier.
Right. And finally, the FCC, telecoms and IoT.
Yeah, the FCC brought enforcement actions against telecom carriers related to things like improper sharing of customer location data, being too slow in reporting breaches, unlawfully retaining data too long, and generally failing to adequately protect customer information. They also launched that voluntary Cyber Trust Mark program. It's like an Energy Star label, but for cybersecurity on smart home devices and other IoT products, aiming to help consumers choose more secure options.
So a whirlwind of regulatory activity.
But one source mentioned a potential shift depending on politics.
Yeah, just to note that looking ahead, there's always the potential for a shift in federal priorities, particularly under a new administration. That could lead to changes in the pace or the specific focus of some of these enforcement efforts, perhaps with a greater emphasis on deregulation in certain areas. Something to watch.
Okay, so we've got the exploding threat landscape and this equally complex, rapidly expanding regulatory response trying to catch up. But what happens when incidents do occur, despite best efforts? That's where the lawsuits start flying, right? Civil litigation seems like a huge and growing risk. It truly is. As we mentioned earlier, while the raw number of breaches reported in 2024 was slightly lower than the year before, the sheer number of victims involved was up dramatically by 257%. That massive pool of affected individuals inevitably fuels class action lawsuits. These typically cover claims like negligence, breach of contract, unjust enrichment, or violations of state consumer protection laws.
And a major fight in these cases is about standing, right? Can the plaintiffs even sue?
Exactly. That's often the first big hurdle for plaintiffs and a key battleground. Standing refers to whether the plaintiffs have actually suffered a concrete injury that the court can remedy. In data breach cases, this often hinges on whether they can demonstrate a credible risk of future harm, like identity theft, or prove that their data was actually misused, not just exposed. Proving that specific link between the breach and actual harm can be really difficult for plaintiffs.
Are new legal arguments emerging too, like this fiduciary duty idea?
Yeah, we're seeing plaintiffs try novel legal theories, like arguing that the company that held their data had a special fiduciary duty, a heightened obligation of trust and care to protect it, simply because of the nature of the relationship. Courts seem pretty divided on this so far. The Alabama Supreme Court, for instance, dismissed such a claim against an employer, saying that the typical employer-employee relationship doesn't automatically create that kind of special duty for data. But interestingly, a Georgia court allowed a similar claim to proceed against a company holding sensitive health information, suggesting that that specific type of relationship might involve a higher duty of care. So it depends on the context.
And the big settlements we hear about, they must influence things.
Definitely. The sources highlight that several significant data breach settlements finalized in 2024 are effectively setting precedents. They influence how lawyers value future cases, how negotiations proceed, and what companies might be willing to pay to avoid trial.
Okay, besides standard data breach suits, there was a mention of a flood of lawsuits about website tracking. What's that about?
Right, this is a huge area right now. These lawsuits focus on common website and app tracking technologies, things like tracking pixels, session replay tools, chatbots, or software development kits, SDKs, embedded in apps. The core allegation is that these tools record user activity like keystrokes, mouse movements, pages visited, chat conversations, and that this recording constitutes illegal wiretapping or eavesdropping under various state or federal laws, often without the user's full consent.
Wiretapping? That sounds serious. How does that work?
Well, it gets complicated fast because the laws vary. The Federal Wiretap Act generally requires only one-party consent, meaning if the website operator consents to the recording, which they usually do since they installed the tool, it might be legal. But several states like California, Pennsylvania, Florida have two-party or even all-party consent laws. In those states, the argument is that the user also needs to explicitly consent to being recorded by these tools, which often doesn't happen clearly.
And the penalties could be high.
Potentially very high. Some of these statutes allow for significant statutory damages, like thousands of dollars per violation or per day, which can add up incredibly quickly in a class action involving thousands or millions of website visitors.
Are companies managing to fight these off easily?
Not easily, no. These cases are proving quite difficult for defendants to get dismissed at the early stages. Courts are really grappling with nuanced technical questions. For example, does hashing the data immediately before it's technically intercepted by the third-party tool mean the communication wasn't actually read or overheard in a way the statute prohibits? The sources mentioned a California case where a court sided with the defendant on that point, ruling that because keystrokes were hashed before being seen, it wasn't a reading under the law. But these are very fact-specific arguments.
Okay. What other litigation trends were mentioned? CDAFA in California.
Yeah, CDAFA is California's state-level analog to the Federal Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFAA. It basically prohibits unauthorized access to computer systems. One interesting legal debate under CDAFA is about the definition of damage or loss. Plaintiffs argue that this should include the loss of the inherent value of their personal data that was accessed improperly, not just physical damage to the computer system itself or costs incurred to fix it. Most courts so far have rejected that lost data value theory for CDAFA, but it's still being argued.
And the CCPA, California's main privacy law that has its own lawsuit angle.
It does, but it's quite limited. The CCPA includes a private right of action, meaning consumers can sue directly, but only if their non-encrypted and non-redacted personal information is breached as a result of a business's failure to implement reasonable security practices. So it doesn't cover all CCPA violations, just this specific type of data breach scenario. There's also ongoing debate about whether traditional service providers, vendors who process data on behalf of another business, can even be sued under this provision, as it primarily targets entities defined as a business under the CCPA.
Is the definition of a breach changing there too?
Sort of. Courts seem to be broadening the interpretation of the triggering event beyond just traditional hacking incidents. They're looking at situations where unauthorized disclosure of data happens simply because of fundamentally insufficient security practices, even if there wasn't a specific intrusion by a third-party hacker. So negligent internal handling could potentially trigger it.
Any other lawsuit types popping up?
Briefly, the sources also mention ongoing litigation related to laws like the Federal Video Privacy Protection Act, VPPA, which restricts sharing of video viewing history. This often targets websites with embedded video players that share data with platforms like Facebook. And similar state-level video privacy statutes are also seeing some action. It really underscores that almost any form of collecting, using, or sharing data these days carries potential legal exposure if not handled carefully.
Okay, whew. So let's recap. We have constantly evolving, intensifying threats. We have this rapidly expanding and fragmenting regulatory landscape trying to set rules, and we have this increasing risk of really costly civil litigation when things go wrong. Faced with all that, how do you actually manage the cyber risk that inevitably remains?
Exactly. That's the critical question. After you've done everything you reasonably can to defend yourself, there's still residual risk. And this is where cyber insurance becomes such a crucial piece of the overall risk management puzzle. As one source put it quite simply, it's about transferring that residual risk, the financial consequences you can't eliminate, to an insurer.
And the sources were really clear on this point. Improving your actual cybersecurity posture isn't just good practice for its own sake. It directly impacts your ability to get effective cyber insurance. It can lead to broader coverage options, potentially better pricing, more favorable terms.
Absolutely. Insurers want to see you're taking it seriously. Marsh, a major broker, provided some key tips derived from the sources on how organizations can become more insurable or improve their insurability. First, you really need to understand your current security baseline. How good are your defenses, really? And how does that compare to others in your industry? Tools like their cyber self-assessment can help benchmark yourself.
Okay, know thyself. What's next?
Second, you've got to tailor your security controls to your specific business model and your specific risks. It's not one size fits all. It's about finding that practical balance between strong security and enabling your business to actually function efficiently. A cost-benefit analysis is really essential here. You don't want security measures so restrictive they cripple your operations.
Right, security shouldn't stop the business. Third point.
Third, prioritize your threats and allocate your limited resources where they'll have the biggest defensive impact. Marsh suggested using financial stress tests to understand the potential return on investment for specific controls. For example, they consistently see that implementing a robust privileged access management (PAM) solution, which controls those super user accounts, correlates strongly with fewer and less severe insurance claims. So that's likely good investment.
Makes sense. Focus on the crown jewels. What else?
Fourth, actively demonstrate a strong cybersecurity culture to your potential insurers. This isn't just about tech, it's about people and processes. It means ongoing employee training, having clear governance structures for cybersecurity, being willing to meet directly with underwriters to explain your program, and maintaining clear early communication, especially if you do, unfortunately, have a claim. Transparency builds trust.
Okay, culture matters. What else?
Fifth, just be prepared. Insurers will likely conduct external vulnerability scans as part of their underwriting, so know what they might find. And sixth, while it can be challenging in this environment, obviously try to maintain a clean claims history if possible. And finally, they suggested that working with a managed service provider, MSP, or a consultant who really understands both the technical side of cybersecurity and the intricacies of the cyber insurance market can be incredibly valuable.
Okay, those are great practical tips. And here's where it gets really interesting, connecting the technical risk back to the financial protection side.
Right.
Actually quantifying your cyber risk.
Yes.
The Cover source made a really compelling point that many companies might actually be overpaying for their cyber insurance. Why? Because their deductibles and their coverage limits aren't properly aligned with their actual quantified financial risk exposure. They're guessing, essentially.
This is exactly where cyber risk quantification, or CRQ tools, come into play. These tools are designed to translate all those technical vulnerabilities and potential threat scenarios we talked about into potential financial losses, dollars and cents. They often use sophisticated modeling like Monte Carlo simulations to run thousands of possibilities. One source mentioned modeling maybe 25,000 different ways the next year could play out from a cyber risk perspective for a given company.
Wow, 25,000 scenarios. That sounds powerful because it turns that technical security jargon into financial language that the CFO and the board can actually understand and act on.
Yeah, precisely. A CISO armed with a credible CRQ analysis can go to leadership and say, look, based on our specific risks and controls, here's our probable range of financial loss from a major ransomware event or from a large data breach. That allows you to have much more informed conversations about why you need a certain level of insurance coverage, or why a particular deductible level makes financial sense, or whether paying extra for specific coverages like ransomware or business interruption is actually worth the premium based on your quantified exposure. It enables smarter negotiation.
Yeah, understanding your potential financial exposure from cyber incidents really does seem fundamental to getting the right cyber insurance policy. And this is exactly where tools and services aimed at calculating your cyber risk, like our sponsor, cyberinsurancecalc.com, can provide really valuable clarity and support. They help you navigate the complexities of securing the appropriate coverage in this incredibly dynamic environment.
Absolutely. It bridges that gap between the technical team and the financial decision makers.
And beyond just quantification, big players like Marsh obviously offer a whole suite of services to help clients navigate this complex space. Things like incident response management support if the worst happens, broader risk advisory consulting, risk intelligence platforms like their Bluey tool to monitor threats, and of course, help designing and placing the actual insurance programs.
And it's not just brokers. Major insurers like Munich Re are also focused on trying to address this protection gap, especially for smaller organizations that might feel overwhelmed or under-resourced. They emphasize the importance of strategic partnerships, collaborating with tech vendors, security experts, brokers, even governments to develop more comprehensive and accessible solutions to help businesses adapt to these evolving risks.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive today.
We certainly have.
We've gone from the intensifying, diversifying cyber threats through the rush of new regulations and the rising tide of litigation trying to keep pace, all the way to the critical role of cyber insurance and proactive risk management, including quantification, and trying to bridge that remaining gap.
It's definitely a dynamic environment, to say the least. Staying resilient, staying ahead, it requires constant learning and adaptation, not just on the technical side, but legally and financially as well. They're all intertwined now.
Absolutely. And maybe here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to consider as we wrap up. Think about the sheer speed at which AI is evolving right now. It's impacting both the cyber threats we face, making them more potent, and it's starting to reshape the regulatory world, forcing new definitions of things like personal data or automated decision-making. How fast will the legal frameworks and the insurance products truly need to adapt just to keep from falling completely behind this AI-driven wave? And maybe more importantly, what does that uncertainty mean for how you need to be preparing your organization starting today?